Okay, good morning and welcome to the Sustainable Farming Association's webinar on silvopasture, a global and historical perspective with Dr. Ashley Conway. My name is Tyler Carlson and I am the SFA's Silvopasture and Agroforestry lead. I thank you for your interest in silvopasture and for tuning in to this webinar. This webinar is being recorded as part of a four-part series on silvopasture and is made possible by a North Central SARE grant. The SFA is coordinating a professional development program to educate agriculture and conservation professionals on silvopasture and oak savanna restoration. The technical assistance is provided by the University of Minnesota Extension and the Savannah Institute. So what exactly is silvopasture and why is the SFA interested in this work? Silvopasture is a practice that integrates livestock on the landscape and is a component of the SFA's overall soil health programming. Silvopasture is the intentional management of timber, forage, and livestock on the same acres. By utilizing managed grazing, 21st century fence and water infrastructure, and sound timber management, we can improve profit and ecological function on the 660,000 plus acres of grazed woodlands in Minnesota. Dr. Ashley Conway joined the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry faculty as an assistant research professor focused on silvopasture in August 2019. Her focus is to provide research and outreach leadership to a silvopasture program focused on understanding forage, tree, livestock interactions in the Midwest US. She has a Ph.D. in animal science from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Prior to her Ph.D., she obtained an MS and BS in animal science at Washington State University. She also worked from 2010 to 2012 as an agroforestry and sustainable agriculture extension volunteer in Zambia, Africa, with the U.S. Peace Corps. Ashley grew up on a small family farm located in Camas, Washington State. The farm is a family-managed herd of dairy goats for grade A raw and pasteurized milk and artisan creamery. They also maintain a small flock of wool sheep, chickens, and bees, cultivated commercial blueberries, lavender, and vegetables. And with that, I will pass the screen sharing on to Dr. Conway. And I will just mention before the presentation that as the presentation continues today, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window to type in questions to our moderators for a question and answer session at the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Thank you to the Sustainable Farming Association of Minnesota for this invitation. So this is the first webinar I've done in the time of COVID. So I think I've had more participants in this type of webinar than I have in the past with my other webinars. So it's so good for you to join us virtually. When I was asked to do this, I'm excited that this is part of a webinar series, and really what I'm hoping to do today is to provide context and really tee up all of the information that you're going to be receiving over the next series of webinars that focus on silvopasture and provide just really a broad overview of why we're talking about silvopasture in the context that we're talking about it, what that looks like here in the Midwest and in North America, and all of the historical factors that have played into our current situation agriculturally and ecologically that makes silvopasture a really pertinent topic in this day and age. So I am going to start with some bits of my, what I would call my stump speech on silvopasture, just to catch everybody up and get on the same page. Silvopasture is one of the 5 commonly recognized agroforestry practices. Here at the top, we have, I've ordered these roughly in what I perceive as the least complex agroforestry practice to the most complex. We've got windbreaks, forest farming, riparian forest buffers, alley cropping. We're starting to get into more complex 2-tier interaction systems. And if you will notice that on the bottom, silvopasture systems, I have put as probably the most complex agroforestry practice. And I don't think that's my particular bias. What we're talking about is adding additional elements to the system, and every element that's added adds a measure of complexity and interaction. So as Tyler started out with defining these three different layers of interaction happen with trees, a forage or fodder crop, and some type of livestock. And so we're talking about silvopasture as the intentional integration and management of all of these three components together in one multifunctional system. The beauty of silvopasture systems is it can look like a lot of different things. So I like to call silvopasture a la carte agriculture because it's an extremely flexible definition that fits a variety of situations and resources that a particular producer may have. So we can talk about, again, timber specialty crops. We can talk about trees for windbreaks and shade. Fodder species are particularly common in tropical systems. So we're planting trees as an additional feed resource for livestock. The forages can be all types of cool and warm seasons, legumes, brassicas, and animals can really fit into any definition. We're talking about cattle, small ruminants, swine, poultry. Possibly my favorite definition of a silvopasture includes pollinators, where we're building a pollinator habitat and planting trees and pollinator forages and having a habitat for bees and producing bees as the livestock component of a silvopasture. Based on this definition, that totally flies, and it pleases me to think about. So what makes silvopasture so flexible and exciting and versatile is also the thing that makes it very difficult to study and makes it very complex, because all of these different species and elements provide different levels and types of interactions, and it really becomes a very interactive web of benefits and costs ecologically, production-wise. And so as we move forward in this webinar series and you start hearing about very specific types of silvopasture and research associated with silvopasture, just try to keep in mind that what we're talking about are very, very specific points in this web with particular ingredients, if you will, and that what may happen and what you might see with one particular combination of trees, grasses, and livestock may not necessarily be the case if you change the species or change the type of tree or even the planting design of the tree. So that's my quick and dirty definition. So, but now I really want to switch gears a little bit. So the goal of this particular webinar for me is to provide some context and context of the research and recommendations that you'll be receiving for silvopasture in this entire series, this webinar series. And I want to start with a land acknowledgement. And some of you, if you've attended conferences or webinars in the past, you may start seeing some of these land acknowledgements being done, which I'm very pleased with. So I am currently in Columbia. I moved to Columbia, Missouri from Nebraska. And so now I respectfully acknowledge that I live and work and celebrate on the traditional ancestral lands of the Kickapoo, the Oto, Missouri, Peoria, Sioux, and Osage nations. So this process of knowing and understanding and acknowledging that this land that we're working on was inhabited by ancestral people who were on this land before us is really important. And it's not just for the element of just acknowledging the land, but for our particular conversation today with silvopasture, it has additional relevance. So if any of you are interested, I highly recommend you check out this native land website. It's a Canadian website. The map is ever changing. As you can see from this map, there's so many different overlapping territories and ancestral grounds, and it's constantly evolving. So I encourage you to go and look and see where you are and learn more about the land that you're on and who inhabited it before colonizers came to the North American lands. And because it will help to frame understanding of how we practice our agriculture and our silvopasture. So it's really important to start here because silvopasture and agroforestry is a globally indigenous land management food production system. So I know I've said previously in other in other talks that if you run into something or someone who says, I have this hot new idea and research is just starting to boom around this concept called silvopasture, and basically we invented it, that really is not correct. And I was encouraged because as I was going through this, doing some research for this particular targeted webinar, I didn't find a lot of resources that framed it that way. Most people tend to acknowledge that agroforestry is a very old practice, but every once in a while it comes up, and I think it's really important that we start from this place and we acknowledge that silvopasture is not new. It's very old, and it has roots across the globe in indigenous land practices. So what I have here are two pictures. This is a relief, a miniature relief that was actually done by Queen Mary Salter. We're talking about like the 12th century here, 1300 to 1320 AD. And what we see is hog producers, if you will, hog tenders with their pigs, hammering down acorns from trees to feed their pigs in a very silvopasture type setting. And over here on the other side, we see, again, this painting was not necessarily done by an indigenous group, but it is depicting the use of fire by indigenous aborigines in Australia to hunt kangaroos. And so this really sets up the beginning of these two different areas that I'm going to focus on today. One, we're talking about a cultivated type silvopasture system, and we're talking about a fire-based cultivation land use system. And hopefully by the end of this discussion, you'll see how they come together today, and they overlap for us and have relevance today. So when I joined the Center for Agroforestry and moved to Missouri and started learning about what the state of silvopasture was in Missouri and in the Midwest, I quickly came to realize that what we're talking about are two different types of silvopasture. We have forested lands that are successional forests. So at some point they've been cleared, they're typically unmanaged. They may be grazed, they may have livestock excluded for many years, but producers are interested in utilizing this wooded land on their property to expand their livestock operations, and they just want to know how to do that. So we're talking about a forested, likely unmanaged starting point here. And then on this side, we have the alternative silvopasture where it's an open field, and we're incorporating and planting trees specifically into this open pasture. And what we end up seeing, hopefully, somewhere in the middle, are a very naturally designed, or a natural silvopasture or a planted and designed silvopasture. So I'm building my research program around targeting these two different types of silvopasture because they really are two different beasts. The resources involved and the interactions involved in a natural ecosystem conversion towards silvopasture is very different than what we might see in a planted silvopasture that was an open field, and we're incorporating, for instance, likely a timber crop like pine or a specialty crop like nuts or fruits. And as I was going through this for this webinar, I realized that this really harks back to this previous slide here, where we see roots from different parts of the world, starting with different types of land management use. And it's kind of given us these two starting conditions today. So what I hope to do over the next half hour or so is really bring us back around to full circle, why we're seeing these two starting conditions here in the Midwest, and why we're having to target these two different types of silvopasture and where we can meet in the middle. So globally, again, silvopasture and agroforestry are very old, ancient practices. We can find references to silvopasture and agroforestry all across the world. And what I've done is sort of highlighted these two different categories that we're talking about. In Europe, very old references to silvopasture and in China that tend to be more focused on intensive cultivation and management of agroforestry. And I'll talk about how that has evolved into what we see today. And then again, that relief that we saw earlier, that picture in Australia and in North America, what we see are land management practices and agroforestry practices that really revolve around the use of fire. So with that in mind, I want to break it out kind of and focus on primarily North America and Europe. What we often hear when we talk about the history of silvopasture is deeply rooted in what we know about European history of silvopasture and agroforestry. And a lot of these other areas are left out of the conversation. And there's a reason for that, and I'll get there shortly. So today I'm going to start talking about where we are in North America and where our North American history stands, and then how the European history has melded with that and brought us to where we are today. So I'll kind of keep these two symbols here. We're talking about land use, historical land use management through fire, and land use management that historically has revolved around more cultivation aspects. Now, I want to preface this before I go too much further and emphasize that I'm not a historian. This is by no means my area of scholarly activity. So most of what I'm presenting to you today is what I have uncovered myself as I've learned more about the history of silvopasture and what that's done to prepare me to develop a research program that has applied benefits for producers today in Missouri and in the regional Midwest. So we're going to start mostly again with this fire as a land management tool. So in my research, I found several documents that are able to direct me to several more documents and resources. And I call it the rabbit hole. You start at one place and you get directed to another place and you end up going down the rabbit research hole. But what I found was that we have evidence here in North America that evolutionarily fire was used for several hundreds, if not thousands of years prior to colonization as an active tool to shape the land that indigenous groups used to shore up their food supply chain. And we can see that these particular authors found that due to the dominance of oak and chestnut in Appalachian forests, we see that those particular trees are enhanced by vigorous resprouting after burning that likely happened for hundreds of years. So attribute that to indigenous burning practices. Axelrod was able to articulate through their research that the extent of tallgrass prairie in the Midwest is really thought to be largely a result of these fires set by indigenous peoples prior to colonization. And in the West, where, as Taylor mentioned, I'm originally from Washington. So in the West, we see the influence of fire. And this particular reference that I was looking at that talked about how fire was used in the West, in the Pacific Northwest, and in California, in these vast forest ranges, we have very dense old growth forests, very damp, humid, or not humid conditions. But even though it's prone to fire, like natural ignition fires, what we see is that there's prairie patches in these forested areas and sugar pine stands. And those places, and what we're able to gather from cultural data, really are able to definitively show, more or less, that these prairie patches and sugar pine stands were only allowed to develop ecologically through the use of fire. Tribal groups took ownership of individual sugar pine stands, and they applied fire to encourage the growth of some of these prairie patches and the sugar pine stands by reducing encroachment from competing species. So we have substantial, and this is just a brief overview, we have a lot of data that's able to show that prior to colonization, fire was really an important tool that indigenous groups were using to shape the land around them and provide food for them. So this was new information to me, and again, I went down the research rabbit hole, and I wanted to learn more about these sugar pine stands in the West. I understand we're not in the West here, but I think this is a really important and intriguing point of interest. So Sugar pine, Pinus lambertiana, is really the second oldest tree that we see, second to only the sequoia in Northern California and Southern California. It's found typically in mixed conifer stands. And this is all from the Forest Service website. So what the Forest Service right now is characterizing sugar pine as. So typically found in very woodland type settings, which tend to be a little bit more open than closed forests. They're very resistant to low and moderate severity fires. They've evolved to have a thick fire resistant bark and a very open canopy. And that open canopy will really discourage fire spreading. And so it makes it very, very fire resilient. And additionally, these trees are very shade tolerant. They're semi-tolerant to shade. And this particular website says that they'll exhibit very poor growth if seedlings are enclosed by brush. So all of these characteristics of this tree, just these natural biological, physiological growth characteristics of sugar pine that is naturally found in California, indicate that they've evolved in a place where they've been exposed to fire and that they grow in areas that really are not encroached by brush. So this tree has evolved in an area that is very woodland, in a very woodland style. And I want to back up to this particular point here. This quote from the site says that early in sugar pine development, large mammals use dense stands as hiding and thermal cover. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that sounds an awful lot like what we're trying to accomplish with silvopasture, right? So what we see, these natural stands of sugar pine that have been cultivated more or less through the use of fire in California and in the West lands, really happened a long time ago. And you don't just get an evolved species in 50-year time span. This had to have happened for several thousands of years to have these native sugar pine stands in the West. So this is a very good book that I would encourage everybody to check out if they're so interested in learning more about this. Again, it is focused on California, but I think there's applications here in the Midwest as well. And this particular reference here, the role of Indigenous burning and land management, I learned a lot from this particular issue. So I encourage you to check it out and learn more. Really, what I want to pull from this right now for this conversation is really to emphasize that the most important outcome of fire use was the intentional creation of a mosaic of habitat patches that ended up promoting food security because it ensured a diverse and productive landscape. And so as we're talking about fire and land use management, the role of Indigenous groups here in North America, this is really an important key thing to keep in mind. So perhaps right now you're thinking, what the heck? I really thought we were going to be talking about silvopasture. So what I want to do is emphasize this point of the role of fire in land use management and how this pertains to silvopasture. And I want to use bison as a case study for you. So to emphasize this more, when we think of bison, we've learned from our schools and history that there used to be hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of bison across the Great Plains. And then they were hunted to extinction by colonizers. And that's all very sad, and now they're recovering. But we tend to think, because of that narrative, for me anyway, and maybe this is just because I didn't grow up in a plain state, but for me, I tend to envision bison grazing wide open spaces on the prairies and in the grasslands. And that's the vision that I have. So this picture is from Yellowstone, so in Wyoming, but we see really open grassy plains, maybe a few trees up here in the mountains, but for the most part, bison stay on the plains, right? That's the song, where the buffalo roam. So I want to challenge this conception a little bit and hopefully draw us closer to silvopasture. So this particular map shows an estimated map of fire regimes based on historical land, like ecological land growth, and what we see as woodland types and grass shrub types across the United States. So keeping in mind that to create a savanna or a woodland, we're talking about fire regimes that happen very frequently. So every 0 to 10 years, we have a fire come through. And that's what's required to maintain an open savanna or woodland type ecosystem. So how that works, because fire will clear out the understory, it burns very, very quick, flashy fuels, it causes disturbance, and this influences the regeneration and species distribution of not only like fast-growing perennial browse species and grass species, but also slow-growing hardwood species. So over time, when we have repeated fast fires, we end up creating an open savanna or woodland because of these aspects of fire. So I want to draw your attention over here. If you can see where I've circled very short fire intervals. Here in this light blue, this is an understory fire of 0 to 10 years. This light green, we have mixed severity fires of, again, 0 to 34 years. And this light pink, stand replacement fires of 0 to 34 years. So these three very light colors all represent places where they're estimating that very frequent fire happened, which will help create an open savanna or woodland. So when we find these spaces on the map, we see that all of this light blue area here, all of this pink area here, over here in the west, there's some light purple areas, and then we have light green up here in Minnesota, in the top of the state. So we're talking about huge areas of the United States, what is now the United States, that are estimated to have very frequent fires and thus evolved to have a very open savanna type woodland. Now, this may not be news to some of you. If you've heard, like up in Minnesota, you guys are focusing really hard on using silvopasture as a restoration technique for oak savanna and woodlands. And I think that's, again, we'll bring that back around to the relevance, because what we're talking about is areas of the United States that historically, for hundreds and hundreds of years, had very frequent fire and have evolved, these tree species have evolved to be in an open savanna woodland. So what does that have to do with bison and livestock? This particular map is the most conservative estimate that I found. There were several other maps that estimated much wider distributions of wild bison in North America, but prior to this estimates at about 1800. So we're talking about just post at the beginning of colonization. This is the native range of North American bison. And personally, again, as someone who grew up just envisioning bison as being confined to the Great Plains states, like around here, to know and actually visualize and see that the range of North American bison is found all the way into the Midwest, into the central states, down here in the Southwest, and really up into the Appalachian Mountains. That was really shocking to me. And again, thinking back to the previous slide about what the fire regimes and the ecosystem must have looked like, we're really talking about this space where the buffalo roamed ended up looking probably a lot like this very open savanna area with mixed species of hardwoods that had evolved and grown with frequent fire. Frequent fire that was likely, some of it was due to natural ignition, but also frequent fire that was managed specifically in that way by indigenous groups. So in this sense, hopefully I've been able to paint a picture that we're able to see that the use of fire as a land management tool in indigenous practice to create these very diverse food systems did end up creating essentially a wild or native silvopasture type setting that then groups were able to hunt. There was ample ruminants. We had bison, we have deer, we have elk, we have all kinds of cloven-hoofed and wild creatures that really love these open woodland type spaces. And it's a very it's an intentional management strategy that ends up being less cultivation intensive, but it's intentional nonetheless. And so in North America, the roots of silvopasture are deeply hark back to fire and indigenous fire use. So I want to take it back to this more global perspective now, where this is only half of the story. So we can talk about what happened in North America prior to colonization and how our ecosystems evolved with fire and with indigenous burning. But then this thing happened, colonization happened, right? And we imported a lot of things from this region of the world. We're talking about um, different types of cultivation practices that end up being a little bit different, and that has shaped where we're at today and how we talk about this particular topic. So just to wrap up, this is from an excerpt of that one reference, not the book, but the role of indigenous burning paper, that I felt like this excerpt nicely summarized kind of the pressure point here. Kimmer and Lake say that indigenous people skillfully modified the fire regime to create a range of forest openings in many different stages of post-fire succession. This enhanced the diversity, the yield of game, berries, roots, crops, edible seeds, and medicinal plants. In contrast, fire was often used by the colonists with a different intent, uniformity, such as production of pastures, cropland, and plantations. So with the arrival of European colonizers, we see really a clash of inherent philosophical differences in land use. And again, this is not my area of expertise. There are much more nuanced and probably far more appropriate interpretations of these inherent philosophical differences. But for our discussion on silvopasture, what we're really kind of talking about is a difference in philosophies based on ecological control and intensive hands-on management versus ecological reciprocity. So this particular article was talking about how indigenous groups really acknowledged and were able to understand and work around the rebirth that happened with fire. Like, yes, it was destructive, but what came of it was a rebirth and more diversity. In Europe, that philosophy was formed for specific reasons, which I'll get into shortly, but fire was something to be managed and controlled and used because it had a much more destructive role in Europe and in European agriculture. And so we see this clash of inherent philosophical differences really being the crux of what has happened now in North America in the last 200 years and how that shaped our research and our ecosystems. So I do want to jump to European silvopasture because it is an important area to mention in the history of agroforestry, because we're talking simultaneously, right? So agroforestry and silvopasture evolved. It's a very old practice in Europe as well. So as indigenous groups are burning and managing the land in North America, simultaneously in Europe, we see indigenous groups and peoples emphasizing their food systems it's a little bit heavier on cultivation, but they're still practicing some of these very give and take natural ecosystem based relationships. So for thousands of years, we see that there's emphasis in these areas on high value temperate tree crops. So some of that's due to geography, some of that's due to culture and politics in the region at the time, several thousands of years ago. Typically what we see, again, like what was depicted in that original relief, that groups in Europe relied on tree crops for animal fodder and stored feed. And in return, in order to grow those feed crops and trees successfully, they relied on the animal manure for the fertility of the fruit and tree nut. So at the time, and the other thing I'll add here is that we have the difficulty as we talk about this is that often European agriculture and silvopasture is overrepresented because we have a longer recorded history that's more easily accessible. We're talking about difference between written and oral traditions. So a lot of what we have here in North America has been lost, and we're having to recreate that through cultural data, through ecological data. Conversely, in Europe, we have longer recorded history that's more easily accessible. So it ends up being, I would argue, more overly represented, and we have a clearer picture of what happened. So I think that tends to skew our perspective to say that it was going on longer, or it was more evolved, or something like that. But really, we're talking about two similar time points where one group is using fire and the other is really relying on give and take relationships with animals and interactions there. What happened as things are evolving in Europe, they really relied on crop rotation. They started to see that with crop rotation and changing of spaces, you can increase soil fertility. And so that really took away some of the impetus, the need to rely on animal manure as a fertility source for these cultivated plots. Again, there's more historical and geopolitical aspects here that I'm sure I'm definitely not covering adequately. But this segregation of agricultural practices is really how European agriculture has evolved. And this was, again, exacerbated. We have the Industrial Revolution and the development of synthetic fertilizer. And so what European agriculture looked like in the 19th century ends up being much more segregated and controlled than agriculture in North America, that ended up being very integrated and naturally ecosystem-based, agro-ecosystem-based. Some of this was due to limited land base. So we're talking about vast areas of land in North America compared to more restricted land base in Europe, and forest structures, just the inherent forest structure that grew up in Europe made fire very destructive, and therefore it was really seen as not a desirable thing. It was a tool of destruction rather than a tool of cultivation. That being said, there is a long history of traditional silvopasture systems in Europe, and this really is kind of, I think, held up if you do a quick search of your own. The Spanish dehesas and montados in Portugal are held up as one of the oldest silvopasture systems in the world. We have pollen cores in Spain that record the earliest emergence of the dehesas in 2500 BC, so thousands and thousands of years old. From these pollen cores, researchers were able to determine, they were able to see that oak and pine forests that were endemic to the area before that were replaced by more scattered oaks and herbaceous vegetation. And these scattered oaks end up yielding more acorns than a more closed canopy of woodland trees. And by adding herbaceous vegetation underneath those oaks, we end up creating an understory that makes very high quality pork. So this is a very old system as well, and it's still being practiced today. This term panache, I'm not pronouncing that correctly. It's French. It is a legal term from the 10th century during the Norman dynasty area. So it describes the right to release swine into a woodland during a specific season, so likely acorn drop season. And if you've ever heard of Jamón Ibérico or Iberian ham, Iberian is not only this heritage breed, this specific breed that developed in the dehesas, but also the region that these pigs are grazed and finished on, end up creating probably the most valuable cut of meat available today. This very rich, very desirable ham and pork that goes for a lot of money. It's still being practiced today. So it's a very old system. The dehesas are a cultural treasure for a lot of people in the region, and indeed, I think I would say globally, that a traditional system has lasted this long and is still economically viable is really exciting and fascinating, and I think something that we should all be proud of. So again, back to fire, the use of hunting woods has a very important role in European agriculture. As cultivation and crop production and livestock production were segregating, what ended up happening in these areas that we end up having spaces specifically for habitat for wild animals, wild herbivores that were used for hunting. So this is from a paper that kind of explores this, the use of hunting in medieval England. This excerpt says that the use of woods for pasture was not normally precluded for hunting. However, economic forces were increasingly to conflict with the preservation of so much woodland. And the forest law was so restrictive, especially as there is this need for additional land for cultivated agriculture. So this ends up creating specific spaces that are kept for hunting and non-cultivated agriculture. And by this time, what we see is the evolution of forests that are really considered just as sources of timber rather than any other purpose. What I want to kind of emphasize here is that what we're talking about is control of understory via two different means. So in North America, we're talking about fire to control understory and open up the canopy. Once you reach a certain point of canopy growth, and with particular species, this ends up being more conducive to this, you end up shading out understory and create a very closed old growth forest that still is able to provide habitat for a lot of species for hunting, but it's not an open savanna silvopasture. So if we think back to this difference in philosophical difference of the use of fire versus cultivation, this is one really important aspect. So at this time, because of the way land use was happening, and the way that fire was considered because of the way that forests were growing, we end up having very different philosophies on what forests were good for and how fire was used, and then how livestock or wild animals were then hunted and grown in these different areas. I hope that makes sense. So if there's any questions, just please put those to our panelists, and we'll be able to talk about this later. This is not necessarily directly related to like European, but I was able to find some more traditional systems in the Mediterranean region. This is from a book that highlights, it's from Ancient Egyptian Materials and Technology. So if you'll pay, like right here, this sentence that shows that the end of grape harvest in ancient Egypt, other scenes are depicted that allegedly show goats foraging on the grapevines after harvest, as in the 12th dynasty tomb of, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, but we're talking about very old, in ancient Egypt, the use of integrated livestock and crop systems. And this picture is from Greece. This is an olive orchard and sheep grazing in the olive orchard. So we're talking even beyond like English or Germanic European agriculture. We're talking about into like African and Mediterranean silvopasture. It's very old traditional systems as well. And particularly these olive groves and orchards, these sheep are still included in practices today. And we're seeing kind of a resurgence of acceptability of incorporating small ruminants into some of these systems. I thought this was interesting, and wanted to add it. But really, okay, Ashley, when are we going to start talking about silvopasture here? This is all very cool, but I'm really curious about what happens next. So hopefully I've painted a picture that shows historically how these indigenous practices in different parts of the world have evolved. Where does that get us here today in the Midwest, in North America? So this painting might be familiar to you. If it's not, it's called Manifest Destiny. It's probably in every high school book curriculum in grade school here. And what I really want to draw your attention to, first of all, there's a lot to unpack here, but for the purposes of our conversation, I want to draw your attention down here to the European colonizers that are, quote unquote, enlightening the West with their plowed fields and their cultivated lands. And what they're doing over here is pushing out the indigenous groups and the bison. And, you know, the philosophy of this painting and of Manifest Destiny in general, westward expansion, was that we're bringing enlightenment to this area, right? This to me really highlights the crux of the issue, because what's happening here from the indigenous groups, there was land use management and cultivation happening for thousands of years. And so this isn't really so much as one, well, let me put it this way. This is really where the philosophical clashes happened. And as we're talking about these two different land use evolutions, we're talking about fire and a more cultivation based, this is really where we start to get into problems and what has led to conditions that we see today. Again, these two starting conditions of an unmanaged woodland or a planted silvopasture, and why we have to talk about these in two different contexts. So today we have this legacy in a lot of places in the Midwest of agriculture abandonment. So during this time, as these two guys right here are plowing over the fields, they've cut down all of this forest land that was managed with fire for thousands of years. They've cleared it all to put in cultivated crops and livestock grazing pastures. And as you know, demographics have changed in the U.S. Industry has come up a very relatively short period of time. This land has been abandoned, and what we have created now are successional forests. So it was originally cleared like 200 years ago, approximately, and what has grown up has, and with the absence of fire and the absence of these species like bison who would normally have inhabited these areas, they've left. We've removed fire. These successional forests end up growing up very differently, and that's what we see a lot of today on our lands. We see successional forests with very different species profiles. We have a lot of invasive, non-native invasive species. And when we remove fire and we remove livestock from these ecosystems and then don't manage it, we end up having very unhealthy woodlands and an ecosystem that really is not very functional. So this is exacerbated even. In 1945, we have pretty solid evidence that when we tried to put livestock back into these woodlands, it really was even more detrimental. So there was an acknowledgement about this time in the 1900s that in the early 1900s, we have the Dust Bowl happening, and we need to be working on our land management and conserving our natural resources, but we can't put livestock back into our woodlots because that ends up leading to lower forage production, reduced animal performance, and most importantly, we really damage the forest ecosystem when we do this. So this is quality data. I mean, at the time, what we have is very robust evidence that we should not be integrating livestock into forests because it's very damaging. And so this really has set the scene. We've established with science that this is not a good plan, and so we've based policy on this for the last almost 80 years that we should not be grazing in woodlands. And I think it's important as we have that conversation, we understand why, well, what led us to that place. We're talking about putting animals into these successional forests that are already, you know, ecologically speaking, they've have whiplash, you know, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They've been cultivated carefully with fire. They've been grazed through with like roaming herds of bison, very high density, less frequent grazing, and that's how these species have evolved. And then we have land use change. We remove fire. We remove these native species, these grazing species, and we have successional forests. And then when we try to put livestock back in, it just ends up being, for all intents and purposes, a disaster. These are really worst case scenarios of grazing in woodlots. So what I want to emphasize here is that when we talk about woodland grazing today, this is what commonly comes to mind. We're talking about unmanaged, putting cattle, typically cattle, into wooded areas, and it ends up being something looking a lot like this. And when we're talking about silvopasture, this is not what we're talking about. These two things are not the same. What we're talking about is intensive and integrated management that really is beneficial for all elements of the equation. So this is where we're going to start talking about silvopasture. So Not going to emphasize too much on data that is relevant today, but hopefully with this previous conversation, we can look at this in a new context. So because the policies have encouraged removal of livestock from woodlands and exclusion of livestock from woodlands, research is several steps behind. So we're looking at silvopasture scientifically, mostly from the designed aspect. So looking at those open pastures, planting trees into those open pastures, and looking at that type of silvopasture system. So that's one thing. The second thing is that because we haven't integrated livestock back in, we just really don't know a lot about how to do so in the best way. Really, we're on the frontier of looking at how do we look at our previous land use and how best can we reintegrate livestock in a way that's ecologically sustainable. So Rob Kallenbach did a study in 2006 in a pine walnut silvopasture, and he found that there was reduced forage biomass in the silvopasture compared to an open pasture, but the two different systems resulted in equivalent heifer performance. So in 2005, Bergler and others found that when we integrated trees into an open pasture, it positively altered botanical composition. 1999, we have a study that shows that forage management actually improved pine timber growth and production instead of not managing forage under those trees, and that this system was financially competitive with ungrazed timber. And in 2008, we have another study that showed that there was a 20 to 39% increase in soil organic carbon, when compared to an open pasture. So these are kind of my highlight studies that I'm not going to spend too much time talking about, but what I want you to take away from this is, because of our history and because of our policy and perceptions on integrating livestock with trees, we're just now starting to sort of scientifically determine things that have been known for thousands of years, that integrating these systems can have very positive impacts on the ecosystem, on biodiversity, that we can see viable animal livestock performance, that it improves soil fertility. These are not really new revelations, but we're just now coming around to a point where scientifically and institutionally we're able to demonstrate and be able to come to terms with. So, which is why I wanted to spend so much time talking about the history and the nuance in this conversation, because as this webinar series moves forward, we're going to be seeing a lot of these types of studies and a lot of this type of data. And I think it's important to understand why we're just now talking about some of these things. As I wrap up here, I want to kind of go back to silvopasture again today. What we're talking about here is this successional forest, this agricultural land abandonment. This was taken down in Rolla, Missouri, so south central Missouri. And this is not an unfamiliar site. We have very thick undergrowth. We have very, very scraggly hardwood stands. And then this producer is working on thinning out the understory and keeping some of his oaks and developing it into a silvopasture on his site. And this, again, this is Missouri, but this has relevance all throughout the Midwest, wherever you're sitting at right now and coming from. Because of our historical land use and the impact and long-term legacy of colonization, this is a common situation throughout many places in the US and in the Midwest particularly. So the potential of using silvopasture as a tool of woodland restoration is really exciting, and I think unbound. It's really an infinite possibility that maybe we can take it back to pre-colonial times and develop some of these open savannas that are really functional, healthy ecosystems. So this is a picture again of his property, where you can very clearly see on this side of the picture of the blue line is where he is thinned and planted. In this particular case, he planted orchard grass and clover, I believe. So an introduced species, but we have vegetative undergrowth. compared to this side that he hasn't cleared yet. And just visually, the impact here is astounding to me, the difference that you can see. And if you think about it, this looks a lot more similar to these historical savannas that we're estimating and we're assuming existed in most of the Midwest a long time ago. So as I wrap up, I have some final thoughts that I really want to emphasize here. I want to reiterate that silvopasture is a very old practice. It's been around for thousands of years in different variations across the world. And we need to acknowledge that silvopasture is an indigenous practice. And it looks like a lot of different things just based on where you are and what the situation was at the time. So whether that's in North America, whether that's in South America, China, Australia, again, this beautiful thing about silvopasture, how diverse and how versatile and how functional it is with depending on where you are, is rooted in the fact that it's evolved simultaneously for thousands of years across the world. What's that brought us to today, however, in our situation, is directly a result of our evolution with colonizing practices. And this has influenced research and policy. And because of that, most of this research and policy has been focused on designed silvopastures, not so much these woodland silvopastures. Hopefully, I've been able to make clear why that's the case. I'm not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing. I'm just saying as we move forward in this webinar and as you hear about some of these practices and recommendations that are derived from our research in these practices, it's important to understand where that's coming from. It's mostly revolved around these design silvopastures and why that's the case. So the question we have to ask ourselves at this point is, how do we apply this very old solution to our modern production challenges? Because we're not going to be able to go back to pre-colonial times in land use practices that were around at that time, but we need to be asking, how can we integrate old practices and the knowledge, the traditional knowledge associated with silvopasture and agroforestry, and apply it in a modern context, something that's viable today that is really going to walk back some of the detrimental effects of our past 200 to 300 years and reach a healthier, more sustainable place. So with that, I think the key word here is integration. Not only are we talking about integrating livestock back into forested ecosystems or integrating trees into conventional pasture production systems, but we're talking about integration of these two philosophies, again, these two quote unquote divergent areas of thought about how we approach food production, how we approach land management and land use. How can we integrate these two philosophies into one sustainable and realistic philosophy that works for today and the challenges that we have today? I hopefully have set up the next webinars for you. My goal was really, again, to provide context. So at this point, I would love to take any questions that you have, if that's all right.
Excellent. Thank you, Ashley. Wayne, have you got a couple questions ready to go there?
Yeah, I got a couple questions. The first one is, why are swine considered for silvopasturing when the DNR and other groups are communicating that wild pigs are very detrimental to the landscape? His comment is, yes, they are unmanaged, but swine on forest land would seem to harm trees with the swine foraging and digging.
Yeah, so this issue of wild swine versus managed swine. So pigs are forest creatures. They're like chickens. They've evolved to function very well in a forested habitat. The problem that we're seeing with wild pigs throughout the Midwest and wild boars is again, I think, really rooted in this imbalance that we're seeing today as a result of land use change. So before, we're talking about before and after, pre and post colonial times, it's likely that these pigs were managed through open canopies, through fire, and through intensive hunting, and the population wasn't destructive in the sense that we see today. mostly because there wasn't really land to be destructive on, if that makes sense. So with now, again, we're trying to come up with, use some of these old practices to apply to modern challenges. The modern challenge that we have now is that most of our food production systems are still very segregated and segmented, and we have specific spaces that are reserved for specific crops and specific types of production. And when those spaces overlap, there can be detrimental consequences. So that wasn't an issue before because everything was able to exist together and simultaneously. But the way that our food production systems now are set up, it ends up being a pressure point and a conflict. So I guess to get at the question of why were they considered valuable in previously and now we have this issue, I think swine can still be valuable, but we have a population issue and we have an ecosystem imbalance issue that we need to we got to come up with some solutions for that. I'm not sure I have the answer to that, what those solutions might be. Pigs are still a valuable cultivated silvopasture option. If you have fruits, if you have nuts, to incorporate hogs under your trees is a very good option. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the wild pigs aren't detrimental to ecosystems as well. Does that answer the question? It's hard to know without the interaction, so I apologize.
Here's another question. What about animals native to the U.S.?
Like bison? I assume would be the leading thought there. I mean, yeah, I guess what about them? We are seeing a resurgence of bison farms, I believe, in the last 10 to 15 years or so. And if we're talking about species that are well suited to savannas, I think we have ample historical evidence to show that bison would do very well in a silvopasture. And in fact, that there's I've forgotten the word I'm trying to use. There's some evidence that tribes in this particular area, they called them forest bison, forest buffalo, because the bison were so common and well seen in these forested areas and existed and would calve out in these forested spaces. So absolutely, I think that, again, we're seeing the difficulty is that bison now are pretty much regulated to safe spaces like Yellowstone, where they're protected in conservation type settings, and to try to figure out a way to realistically integrate them into an agro-ecosystem is a challenge that we need to come up with a solution. Does that look like maybe encouraging bison production in a silvopasture? I would say that's a viable option. We're not going to be able to have the same movement of herds that we did prior to colonization, but that's, doesn't mean that we can't raise bison in a more conventional setting, in a silvopasture type setting, that they would be well suited towards.
We have two members. This is Teresa Caveney. SFA actually has two members who employ silvopasture practices with bison. They also have literally every other large and small ruminant, beef, cattle, swine, as well as sheep and goats.
That's fantastic. And I think that personally, I think that's the direction that we should be trying to figure out how to move towards. And not the direction being specifically bison, but the direction being, how can we develop livestock production systems and food production systems that are rooted in traditional land use and management practices, but that we can update for modern food chain and supply chain purposes. So we're really, again, we're talking about a new frontier historically about how we produce our food, how we raise our animals. What can we take from what we know historically about the land and how it was managed before? What can we take from what we've learned about conventional practices? And how do we figure out the best way to mesh them into a system that is ecologically sustainable, socially sustainable, and something that will contribute to our food security in the long run.
Yeah, carrying on the bison issue, what was responsible for the disappearance of bison from the area east of the Mississippi?
So, my understanding, again, I'm not a historian, but my understanding is that it's multifaceted. So you have two components with the disappearance and near extinction of North American bison. The first component is sort of directly what we talked about today, where we essentially removed their habitat by Europeans arrived, and with their perspective that forests are intended for timber rather than habitat or livestock cultivation, they utilized those forests for timber. They cleared those spaces. They made pastures. They made cropland. That was their philosophy. So bison were now restricted in where they could go. They lost all of that habitat. And there is a second component that's, if I'm being completely straightforward, is rooted in racism. Specific intentional moves by the US government and encouraged by industry to target and hunt buffalo and bison because they knew it was an important resource for Native American tribes in the area. So there's two components there, and that's on both sides of the Mississippi. I think they're both entwined. What we see is thinning and destruction of herds that moved freely throughout, on both sides of the Mississippi, throughout the North American region. As you lose habitat on the east of the Mississippi, as you have more agriculture, more cultivated agricultural presence, these bison herds are going to be less inclined to move in that space. And then you have further encroachment through hunting and extermination as a measure of genocide, really, is what we're talking about. So it's multifaceted, but I would say that those two components are probably the most important reasons.
Mm-hmm. Here's a comment and then a question. There is a state tax benefit to having a forest management plan and implementation of that plan, reduction of approximately 1/3 of property taxes due to 2C land classification. Will silvopasturing be part of forest management plans in the near future so that there can be some tax advantages to having land in silvopasture?
That's a great comment and question. I don't know if I can specifically speak to that, if that's a state-specific thing or a regional or federal issue. What I will say, and maybe if somebody else can add, but I would say, based on my gut hunch and what I hope to do, is that I hope to see it included in the future. I can't speak to whether it will be included now or is going to be included, but what I hope to do, particularly with my research, because again, we're talking about there's not a lot of research to definitively show the benefits of reincorporating livestock into woodland areas. And I hope that I was able to make clear why that's the case historically. But what we have in present day at this very moment is no data. And our policy is derived from data. And so until we have studies that are able to demonstrate the benefits and how best to come up with recommendations to mitigate the risks, we need to advocate for it. Once we get that data, which I hope to do in my position here, then we can start advocating to include that in policy as a viable forest management plan.
I'll say, this is Tyler. My understanding, and Jeff Jackson, please jump in after I'm done here if I've mischaracterized anything, but my understanding is right now the state forest incentives require that forest land is not managed for agricultural purposes as defined by that statute. And there is no intention at this point that I understand to include silvopasture. Silvopasture would be considered an agricultural practice because you're producing livestock for sale. And in addition to that, and sort of over and above it, were someone to convert or be utilizing silvopasture, that land is already probably classified as ag, and as a result receives an even greater tax incentive than the forest tax incentive provides. So there's already a greater incentive to implement silvopasture from a tax perspective than to enroll it into a forest plan.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. I don't have too much to add to that. That's my understanding also. But in a conversation with the Department of Revenue a few weeks ago, what they told me is that these classifications can differ from county to county. And it's often based on the county land assessor's interpretation of tax benefits. And so it's not real consistent across the state of Minnesota. And that's something that we're working on with the Department of Revenue for there to be a consistent interpretation of those tax benefits.
Great, thanks, Jeff. A little bit more time for questions here, yeah.
Okay. Is there a minimum acreage needed for silvopasture practice?
That's a great question. And I think the short answer is no. But the caveat that I will add is it really depends on what species you're working with. So if we're talking about cattle, then that minimum acreage is going to look very different than silvopasture with chickens, you know? So at this point, I don't think we have enough data to have recommendations for every particular manifestation of silvopasture that you could possibly have. I think at this point, what we're really advocating for and talking about is working with your technical professionals, working with people who have expertise in forestry and silvopasture, in ecology, and coming up with what your land has and what the restrictions are based on your resources. A lot of what your silvopasture system will look like will depend on what your soil types are, what trees will grow well in your area, what forages will grow well, what your land base looks like. If you only have 5 acres, what your silvopasture is going to look like will be very different than if you have 50 acres of unmanaged woodlands. So I would say no, but also yes.
Okay, here's a question. You showed photos of an unmanaged successional forest being transformed into a savanna landscape. Do you know how the farmer removed the brush and undesired trees, and were chemicals used in the process?
That is a great question. So this particular producer, actually this picture that's up right now is it's a view from some of his converted land. He used mechanical implements. So he actually, this is worth talking about. So this particular producer has access to heavy machinery through his side business of heavy equipment rental. So if you normally don't have access to that, you would have to, the cost to clear is daunting, and it's something that we're considering how best to provide recommendations for producers. So he mechanically removed with bulldozer, with skid steer, and heavy machinery. I don't believe he used any herbicides at this point. What he's hoping, when I talked to him, he had some he broadcast seeded this particular crop of orchard grass and clover, and wasn't really happy with how patchy it is here, but he was hoping to have enough forage growth that he could graze this coming spring and minimize resurgence of invasive species. He has a lot of autumn olive and multiflora rose, and it's likely that as soon as he clears this out very suddenly, from an ecological perspective, that we would see a boom in these invasive species as they have unrestricted light and water. So yes, he used mechanical means. There are several ways that you could go about clearing your land. The first one being mechanical. We have a cost to overcome there and an access issue to overcome. You can also go in with herbicides. Currently, my understanding is that the Forest Service recommendation for managing non-native invasive species is an herbicide regime. The third option that I'm exploring right now and trying to figure out how to advocate for is the use of livestock to clear for a silvopasture. So contracting out with particularly goats are well suited to this very scrubby underbrush type environment. Trying to find a goat contractor to put goats in and intensively graze and remove a lot of this browse, and then be able to go in and reduce that equipment cost and follow up with mechanical and herbicide regimes as you move through this conversion process. The challenge, I'll end with this thought here. The challenge, as we're talking about how best to do this restoration or conversion process, is that we really don't know the best way to go about it. We don't have recommendations. We don't have enough data to show what will happen if you do it one particular way or another. So we're really experimenting with producers who have, like this particular guy who has just sort of done it on his own. We're trying to work with as many innovative people as possible who've converted their land and what that looks like. And my goal and outlook in my position here is to really start developing some studies to look at this conversion process and come up with some good steps and recommendations for producers on how to go about making this transformation back to an open woodland savanna. Where are the places on your property where it's suited for? Where are places on your property that we really shouldn't be going about this and we need to be managing that forest land differently? What are the pressure points involved there? We have more questions than answers at this point. That was a very long way of answering that question, but I think it's important information to add here.
Okay, a question just came in on the goats. Any suggestions for goat species or types that are better for grazing shrubs and understory?
Just goats, I would say. We have a number of producers who use Spanish crosses. Kiko mix Boer goats are particularly meaty animals. So I think it depends on your goal again. So if it's something that you want to use your own goats and invest in some goats and get some economic benefit by raising some livestock on your browse while you make this conversion process, I would recommend getting a Boer cross or a meat species like a Spanish goat, because they'll grow better for meat. But that's not to say that if you have some dairy goats, you can throw your dairy goats in there and they would motor that down, and then you'd be able to keep your milk production going as you make milk or cheese or what have you. So really, I mean, goats in general, there's really no specific breed. They are very hardy and very well suited to browsing.
Okay. I have two questions left. How do you plan on bringing in and lifting up native experts in this field?
Oh, that is an excellent question. So specifically in Missouri, our Center for Agroforestry and the University of Missouri was gifted as part of an estate gift about a 550-acre farm in south central Missouri, near the Lake of the Ozarks. And in this particular estate, it was willed that the Osage people would be included. Really, the owner really just wanted it named after Chief Standing Bear. And so conversations started occurring with the Osage people, and they said, well, we really, that's great, we appreciate this, but we really would like it to be named for all Osage. So earlier this fall, in October, we opened up the newest research center in the University Research Network system, and it's called the Land of the Osages Research Center. About 550 acres of untouched wooded areas in the Ozarks, and this particular land is going to be managed with in conjunction with the Osage Nation and the Center for Agroforestry to really develop research projects that are specifically targeted to preserving and understanding traditional ecological knowledge, And that really looks like a variety of things at this point. It's still very new, very much in its infancy. And we're hoping that what comes of this in the future is a specific research space for where we can actively incorporate and invite Indigenous groups in the area to have a role in the research process. So that's the first thing that I love talking about. It's very exciting and so encouraging, and I'm so delighted to be part of it. Hopefully in the future we may have some silvopasture geared projects there. At this point, I've made a specific effort to not develop any research to be taking place there until I can meet with counterparts in the Osage Nation to really come up with research questions that they have, that they need, and that they want to be part of. But it's a goal that I have personally and professionally, that the Center for Agroforestry is really working very hard to maintain that relationship and encourage interaction. And just part of our personal philosophy. So that's something that we're doing. I would say more generally, something that we all can do is really just take what we learned today. Hopefully, I was able to convey today, and as we move forward in this webinar series and in other interactions with agroforestry or silvopasture groups, really just kind of take what we learned about silvopasture and agroforestry being an Indigenous practice and understand that as we incorporate some of these old traditions, where they really came from and what they're rooted in. And I think that's the best way that we can continue to acknowledge and not co-opt agroforestry as a new practice and claim it as our own. Yeah.
Here's another question on an old system. Have any efforts been made to duplicate the Spanish Dehesa method in the U.S.?
Specifically, to my knowledge, what that ends up looking like, just because climate and geography and soil type are so different, what that production system looks like are nut, like oak cultivated pastures with pigs. So it's not technically, it's like champagne, right? If it's only champagne if it comes from the Champagne region of France, otherwise it's sparkling wine. And I think that the Iberian ham is kind of the same way. It's only Jamon Iberico if it comes specifically from the Iberian Peninsula and the Dehesa production system. But what we see here, we can grow oaks of all kinds, and we can finish our hogs under those oaks and have an exceptionally rich and flavorful ham that's high quality, that's nutritious, that has a lot of exceptional market value because of the way it was raised. We're taking a lot of those traditional elements that we see in the Dehesas without necessarily the geological environment of the Dehesa that makes it so special. So one of the components of the Dehesas are not just the oak trees, but also cork trees. And to my knowledge, cork doesn't really grow very well in a lot of places in the US. So we can take it and make it a variation on our own and have the same elements, but it's still going to look different, and it's still going to need to be managed a little bit differently just because of geographical and regional differences.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions here. Thank you, Dr. Conway. That's a perfect presentation to set us up for the webinars going forward. I have one last screen to share, and I'll invite Jeff Jackson to jump in here to talk for a few minutes before we conclude today on the Silvopasture Learning Network.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. To give everyone just a brief introduction on what the Silvopasture Learning Network is and where it came from. So it's a partnership between several organizations funded by an LCCMR grant from the state of Minnesota. So the groups we have working on this are U of M Extension, SFA, the Minnesota DNR, and Great River Greening. And the purpose of this grant, well, it's really twofold. So we're doing quite a bit of research on silvopasture at the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge. And as Ashley had mentioned just a few minutes ago, we need data. And So what we're focusing on is data in terms of how does silvopasture work for ecological restoration and restoring oak savanna. So then the other part of the grant is education and outreach, and that's where the Silvopasture Learning Network comes in. Our goal is to build knowledge and relationships for successful silvopasture and oak savanna restoration. So as part of that, we'll be leading field days, volunteer events, and unfortunately, like so much of life today, those are on hold, waiting to see what advice comes out on holding those types of in-person events because of the pandemic. But we will be having those in the future, putting on webinars and cafe chats. So we do have a website. You'll see that listed on your screen. And on the website, we're putting training resources for silvopasture, as well as events and webinars that are coming up. And after this webinar concludes, you'll be receiving a survey, and there will be a place there where you can opt in to be on our email list. And we hope you'll choose to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And then the last thing is to plug and suggest that everyone take a chance to go look at the Silvopasture resource page for the SFA. The link is there on the slide. There you'll find these webinars once we have them ready to put online for future viewing. You'll also find the newly released and created resource manual for silvopasture in Minnesota. It's specific to Minnesota and a lot of the resource folks who are listed, but the information in there will be useful to anyone really in the upper Midwest. It's a great resource to get started learning about silvopasture, whether you're a forester or a farmer or a resource professional. There's a lot of great information, as well as individuals and organizations to help you get on the right track with whatever work you're doing around silvopasture. In addition to that, you'll find future events, and my contact information is there, tyler@sfa-minnesota.org, and my phone number. Yeah, please reach out with any questions that you have for myself or SFA. And with that, that concludes our webinar. Thanks again to Dr. Conway and to the panelists and everyone who attended. We'll see you in the future.
Thank you, Tyler and Dr. Conway.
Thank you for having me. If you have any questions, please reach out.